The worst air disaster in aviation history, it almost doubles any previous death toll. With wreckage and remains spread over many miles, this favourite picnic spot of Parisians presents a grim scene of carnage and despair. The search for clues to the cause of the crash will be long and difficult.
You are listening to Inside the Black Box. This is the story of Turkish Airlines 981.
Pull up! Pull up!
On a cool winter morning, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 touches down at Orly International Airport, 7 kilometers south of Paris, in France. It is 11 a.m. on the 3rd of March, 1974. Turkish Airlines Flight 981, which left Istanbul at just before 8 a.m., has arrived at its intermediate stop before its final destination of London Heathrow. The aircraft is carrying 167 passengers. Most of them are Turkish nationals. At Orly International Airport, 50 passengers are scheduled to disembark. While the second stage of the route from Paris to London is normally underbooked, today is different. Hundreds of passengers are stranded at Orly due to a strike by Air France and British European Airways personnel, cancelling scheduled flights to London. Many have booked onto Turkish Airlines 981 in order to get to London. A total of 216 additional passengers have booked to board the aircraft, filling it to capacity. Most of them are British. Those who secure a seat consider themselves lucky. There are many stranded travellers who are not able to make it on the flight. As soon as the aircraft is parked at gate A2, airport support personnel swarm around the aircraft. Additional fuel is loaded, and baggage handlers begin the task of offboarding and onboarding luggage. Baggage and mail from Istanbul is unloaded from the cargo compartments, and the additional passengers' baggage is loaded. The additional baggage is stowed in the forward and centre cargo compartments of the DC-10. The aft cargo compartment is emptied of mail and baggage from the disembarking passengers from Istanbul, and the cargo door is closed. Around 30 minutes behind schedule, the additional passengers are finally seated and their baggage is loaded. A total of 334 passengers and 12 crew members are aboard. At 10 minutes past 12, the flight crew of Turkish Airlines 981 make contact with Orly Air Traffic Control to discuss their departure. The flight crew are all Turkish. In command is Captain Nejat Berkoz, aged 44, with 7,000 hours of flight experience. His first officer is Oral Ulisman, aged 38, with 5,500 hours of flight time. Finally, completing the flight crew is flight engineer Erhan Ozer, aged 37, with 2,100 hours flight experience. At 12:24, Turkish Airlines 981 is given clearance to taxi. The DC-10 pushes back from gate A2 and heads for runway 08. 5 minutes later, Turkish Airlines 981 is given permission to line up on runway 08 with an initial clearance to climb to 4,000 feet. At 11:30, the fully loaded DC-10 leaves the ground and begins tracking to the east. At 11:33, Orly Air Traffic Control clears Turkish Airlines 981 to climb to 6,000 feet. 1 minute later, the aircraft reaches this altitude and is transferred to the North Area Control Centre. This centre manages the airspace in the north of France. The air traffic controller at the North Area Control Centre clears Turkish Airlines 981 to climb to 23,000 feet and instructs them to turn to the north, towards their destination of London Heathrow. The air traffic controller monitors the progress of Turkish Airlines 981 using 2 radar scopes. The controller's primary radio scope provides information on the location of an aircraft relative to the radar installation. The secondary radar sends out a signal, which when received by the DC-10 causes the aircraft's transponder to send a response to the radar installation, giving information on the aircraft's identity and altitude. At about 11:40, 10 minutes after taking off, the air traffic controller monitoring Turkish Airline 981's progress receives a strange radio transmission. He hears multiple voices, talking hurriedly in a language he does not understand. In the background, alarms can be heard. At the same time, on the controller's secondary radar scope, the controller sees something disturbing. The label of Turkish Airlines 981 on the scope suddenly disappears. Simultaneously, on the primary scope, the radar echo of Turkish Airlines 981 splits into two. One echo remains stationary on the screen. The other echo begins veering off from its course of 350 degrees, travelling to the west. All the while, the confused radio transmission continues to be broadcast. After 30 seconds, the transmission stops. The two radar echoes remain on the scope, one staying stationary, the other travelling off to the left. There is silence for 20 seconds as the controller watches the echoes. Suddenly, the radio transmission begins again and continues for 7 seconds. Then, silence. The moving echo on the scope disappears. The controller tries to contact Turkish Airlines 981, but he does not receive any response. As he continues trying to make contact, the stationary radar echo on the primary radar screen also disappears. Over 5 minutes, the controller tries 8 times to reach Turkish Airlines 981, but to no avail. Search and rescue operations are immediately commenced, using the location of the radar echoes to identify the approximate area for authorities to search. At 12:15, 45 minutes after Turkish Airlines 981 had left the ground at Orly International Airport, the first rescuers arrive at the location of the radar echo which had been moving and disappeared first. The location is Ermenonville Forest in Oise. Ermenonville Forest is made up of Scots and maritime pines, about 10 metres tall, and is a popular destination for Parisians. At the edge of the normally tranquil forest, the rescuers encounter a scene of complete destruction. It becomes clear that the worst possible outcome has occurred. The DC-10, travelling from west to east, has smashed into the top of the trees in an almost flat attitude. It has cut a swathe through the forest, destroying hundreds of trees. The wings and wing-mounted engines of the aircraft have been ripped off. 300 metres after first hitting the trees, the DC-10's fuselage has slammed into the ground itself. Immediately, the aircraft has disintegrated into thousands of pieces. Wreckage has been propelled through the forest for another several hundred metres. In all, the trail of wreckage was 700 metres long. There is barely any fire since the aircraft has disintegrated into such small pieces. There is barely anything left that was large enough to burn. Among the wreckage are the remains of the passengers and crew of Turkish Airlines 981. Just as the DC-10 had disintegrated, those aboard had suffered a similar fate. Search and rescue teams comb the forest in an effort to find survivors. Bodies and body parts are transferred to the local Saint-Pierre de Senlis church. Search and rescue operations continue until 5:45 that evening, before they're called off. There are no survivors of Turkish Airlines 981. 346 people have perished. Only 40 of the 346 passengers and crew were visually identifiable. French authorities would eventually recover 20,000 fragments of human remains from the forest in Ermenonville. Fingerprinting would be used to identify many of the Turkish and Japanese nationals aboard since both countries employ a national fingerprint register. Dental records and personal items helped identify others. Many British families were not even aware their loved ones had been on the flight, since so many had booked onto the flight last minute. The search for answers starts as soon as the search for survivors ends. The following day, a commission of inquiry is established in order to study the circumstances, investigate the causes, and draw conclusions on what happened to Turkish Airlines 981. The investigation is led by the BEA, the French equivalent of the National Transportation Safety Board in the United States. Representatives from Turkey, the United Kingdom, and Japan were invited to be involved in the investigation due to the significant number of casualties belonging to those nationalities. US safety experts were also invited to participate, given the aircraft was designed and built in the United States. While searching through the wreckage of the aircraft, the investigators are able to find the first of the aircraft's black boxes, the digital flight data recorder. Unfortunately, the magnetic tape, which stores the data on the aircraft's performance, has been almost cut in half in the incident. It is sent to its manufacturers in the United States to see if that data is salvageable. The initial media speculation in France and in the United Kingdom was that a bomb had been placed on the aircraft. This was also the initial working theory of the investigators themselves. After all, the DC-10 involved in the accident was almost brand new. The aircraft, with production designation Ship 29, was originally destined for Japan, for All Nippon Airlines. However, due to a bribery scandal, All Nippon Airlines refused to buy the aircraft. Instead, the DC-10s were sold to Turkish Airlines. On the day following the accident, Monday, March 4th, searchers continued to look for the source of the second radar echo, which had disappeared after the impact of the aircraft. In a freshly ploughed field, police and investigators make a grim discovery. In the field, alongside some other aircraft wreckage, are 2 rows of 3 seats from the DC-10, with their occupants still belted into them. These seats had fallen out of the DC-10 before the aircraft had travelled another 15 kilometres and crashed into the forest at Ermenonville. The route of the passengers' exit from the aircraft was clear. Beside the seats were the remains of the rear cargo door. This immediately suggests to the investigators that the aircraft, whether by accident or through a malicious act, had depressurized. A commercial airliner cruises at an altitude where air pressure is very low and the air is very thin. If an aircraft was to fly at its normal cruising altitude without being pressurized, any humans would lose consciousness very quickly due to the lack of breathable air. This is called hypoxia. To overcome this, airliners are pressurized to a level where humans can breathe normally. This is usually equivalent to an altitude of 6,000 to 8,000 feet. The body of the aircraft must be strong enough to withstand this pressurization. Points, such as windows and doors, cause potential areas of weakness. The main passenger doors of the DC-10 are known as plug-type doors, which open inwards. When these doors are closed, the pressure inside the aircraft actually pushes the door against the fuselage, which helps to maintain the seal. The greater the difference in pressure, the stronger the seal. But the cargo doors on the DC-10 are different. Instead of taking advantage of the pressure difference by having doors which open inwards, the DC-10 has cargo doors which open outwards. In order to maintain pressure, a mechanical locking system must be used instead. The lock consists of 4 latches mounted to the bottom of the door. To operate the door, the ground crew press and hold a button, which causes the door to swing closed. As they continue to hold this button, latches attached to the door rotate and hook onto bars mounted on the body of the aircraft. The force of the latches gripping these bars creates a seal. To secure these latches in place, a handle is turned on the outside of the aircraft. Turning the handle causes locking pins to be driven past the latches so they cannot move back again. Additionally, turning the locking handle closes a vent in the door and turns off a light in the cockpit, warning that the cargo door is not secure. If this locking handle is not engaged, the aircraft would not pressurize because the additional air would escape out of the vent and the warning light in the cockpit would remain on, indicating to the pilots that there is a problem with the rear cargo door. At the site where the 6 passengers have been found, the investigators conducted a visual examination of the wreckage of the cargo door. There did not appear to be any burn marks on the door, which suggested it was not fire which brought down the aircraft. The 2 main bolts, which attach the latching mechanism to the door, have sheared off, and the mechanism hangs loose. It is also clear that the latches on the cargo door are open and not in their closed position. The locking pins are also not engaged. There is no way the latches could have been in this position if the cargo door had been properly secured. But as we discussed before, there was no way the pilots would have taken off without the cargo door being secure. Also, although cabin depressurizations are rare, they do happen, but they do not normally result in the loss of an aircraft. So what happened with Turkish Airlines 981? The door mechanism is taken away for detailed analysis in collaboration with authorities in Switzerland. There, a number of discoveries are made. The first is that the latches on the door have not been fully extended in order to reach what is known as an over-center position, a position where the door lock is irreversible without human intervention. Think of a light switch. When a certain amount of force is exerted, the switch changes from one position to another. But if insufficient force is applied to change the position, the switch is stuck in a state in the middle where only a small amount of additional force can change the state of the switch either way. The same had happened with the DC-10's door latches. The ground crew, who had pressed the button to close the door, had not held it for long enough for the latches to fully engage. This left the door in a state where instead of the increasing pressure making the seal stronger, the forces of the pressurization were put on the locking mechanism itself. The force, which was normally absorbed by the latches, travelled up the latching mechanism to the bolts which secure the entire mechanism to the door. Therefore, the only thing securing the door closed and maintaining pressure within the aircraft was the strength of those 2 bolts attaching the latching mechanism to the door. Eventually, the force caused by the difference in pressure that had gradually built as the aircraft climbed higher was too large for the bolts to withstand, and they sheared. This allowed the latches to slip free. With nothing securing the door anymore, the air inside the DC-10 rushed out, causing the cargo door to be ejected. It was clear that the cargo door was improperly latched, but how was the DC-10 able to take off if the door had not been fully secured? The answer stems from the locking pins and the mechanism used to control them. As we discussed earlier, the latches were not fully closed. This should have meant that the locking handle could not move. The vent on the door would remain open, which would not allow the aircraft to pressurize, and a warning light would have illuminated in the cockpit. Unfortunately, modifications had been made to the locking pins by Turkish Airlines, which meant that they barely extended far enough to secure the latches. Also, the torque tube on which the locking pins were mounted had been damaged by repeated operation over time. This meant that the locking handle on the outside of the aircraft could be moved, even though the locking pins weren't in their correct position. The locking handle closed the vent and turned off the warning light in the cockpit, giving the impression that the door was completely secure. The indication that the door was completely secure was only coincidental. It was not a consequence of the locking pins being fully engaged. There were instructions on the operation of the door, printed in English and Turkish beside the door's control panel. But the baggage handler, who would later be heavily criticized in the press, despite speaking 3 languages, spoke neither English nor Turkish. There was also an inspection port where the ground crew could view whether the locking mechanism had been properly engaged. However, the handler had been told that as long as the locking handle moved, this meant the door was secure, and he did not look in the inspection port. The investigators therefore understood how the DC-10 was able to take off without the cargo door being properly locked, but this did not explain why the DC-10 had crashed. Clues to the cause of the crash were also to be found in the field where the cargo door had been discovered. The passenger seats gave a vital indication to the cause of the accident. The aft cargo compartment of the DC-10 sits below the rear passenger area. Both areas are not separately pressurized. Instead, vents in the floor of the passenger cabin allow air to travel between the passenger area and the cargo compartment so that the pressure is equalized. Unfortunately, when the aft cargo door blew off, this left a sizable hole in the aircraft for the pressurized air to leave and equalize to outside pressure. The higher pressure air within the aircraft rushed out of the hole where the cargo door once had been, coming first from the cargo compartment. The air in the passenger compartment would follow next, but the only means of it escaping was through the small vents between the cabin floor and the cargo area. The vents and the floor they were attached to were put under enormous pressure as the air in the cabin tried to escape. This pressure proved too much for the floor structure, which collapsed down towards the cargo compartment. As the floor buckled, the pressure of the floor structure snapped numerous control and hydraulic cables which ran from the cockpit at the front of the aircraft to the tailplane at the rear. On the tailplane of the DC-10 are a number of controls and equipment which are essential to the operation of the aircraft. The first is the DC-10's number 2 engine. The next are the aircraft's elevators, which enable the pilot to control the pitch of the aircraft, and finally, the rudder, which allows the pilot to control the yaw of the aircraft. When the floor collapsed, the control cables and hydraulic lines were snapped, rendering the pilots unable to control some or all of the functions on the tailplane. After severing the control cables, the floor and the passengers who'd been sitting on it were ejected from the DC-10's cargo door. The cockpit voice recorder, which was found on the 7th of March, 5 days after the accident, and the flight data recorder confirms the theory. With all of this information, the crash from the perspective of Turkish Airlines 981 is clear. At 11:40 a.m., Turkish Airlines 981 was climbing to its assigned altitude of 23,000 feet. As the DC-10 passed 11,500 feet, a muffled thump is heard on the cockpit voice recorder, followed by the rushing sound of air. The sound is the depressurization event, which caused the aft cargo door to be ejected and the floor to be torn away, severing the control cables and hydraulic lines. Immediately, a warning horn for pressurization can be heard, and the aircraft's nose pitches down. The DC-10's number 2 engine, which sits on the tail of the aircraft, begins to throttle back towards idle. Inadvertently, the flight crew begin broadcasting what is going on in the cockpit to the air traffic controller at the North Area Control Center. First Officer Ulisman sets the 2 remaining engines to idle, but with the aircraft pointing downwards, the speed of the DC-10 begins to build. Captain Burkos correctly assesses the problem as a cabin depressurization, stating that the cabin has blown out. Captain Burkos orders First Officer Ulisman to pull up the nose of the aircraft. The DC-10 does not respond and continues to descend. 22 seconds after the sound of the decompression, the angle of the dive has increased to 20 degrees and speed is building quickly. An alarm sounds in the cockpit, informing the crew that the aircraft is overspeeding, going past the speed at which the aircraft is designed to fly at. 30 seconds after the depressurization, the aircraft has fallen 4,500 feet and is travelling at 430 knots. The crew try to work through the problem, with Captain Burkos asking whether they have lost hydraulics, to which First Officer Ulisman replies, "There is nothing left." Captain Burkhaus remarks that it looks like they're going to hit the ground. In a last-minute effort to stop the dive, the captain brings the aircraft's engines to full power. The DC-10 does actually begin to pull up, but it is too late. Turkish Airlines 981 plows into the treetops, travelling at 423 knots, cutting a swathe through the marine and Scots pines before smashing into the ground itself. From the first sign of a problem to the aircraft hitting the ground, 77 seconds have elapsed. Those who had been ejected from the cabin of the aircraft fell more slowly. It is very likely that the passengers strapped to the seats were conscious as they fell from the sky into the ploughed field below. They survived about a minute longer than their fellow passengers still in the DC-10. On the surface, the disaster might appear to be a freak accident, a chain reaction of events which led to the destruction of an aircraft that could have never been foreseen or predicted by its manufacturers. But in reality, there had been a very similar incident involving the exact same model of aircraft only 2 years earlier in 1972 in the United States. American Airlines Flight 96, operating between Los Angeles and New York, suffered an explosive decompression over Windsor, Ontario, in Canada. In the exact same fashion as Turkish Airlines 981, the aft cargo door of the aircraft blew open during the flight, only this time being caused by a baggage handler forcing the door closed. This caused the floor of the cabin area to partially collapse into the cargo compartment, severing a number of control cables, which disabled the rudder and the number 2 engine. The only reason American Airlines 96 did not suffer the same fate as Turkish Airlines 981 was because not all of the control cables leading to the DC-10's tailplane were severed. American Airlines Flight 96 was able to land successfully at Detroit Metropolitan Airport. Following the National Transportation Safety Board's investigation, there are 2 major recommendations to the Federal Aviation Administration, responsible for regulating aviation in the United States, were the following. 1. Perform modifications on the DC-10's cargo door to make it impossible to engage the locking handle if the locking pins were not correctly engaged. Also, to provide a means of verifying that the locking pins had been engaged. 2. Install relief vents in the floor of the passenger compartment to avoid the collapse of the floor in the event of a decompression. While the FAA supported modifications to the locking mechanism, they believed the modifications to the floor vents would be too costly. It was agreed between McDonnell Douglas and the FAA that the modifications to the aircraft would be performed as a service bulletin only, which usually meant the modifications were made as part of another major overhaul of the aircraft. In other words, the DC-10 could continue to fly with this serious design flaw. Following the American Airlines 96 incident, a senior engineer at Convair, the company which designed the cargo door under contract from McDonnell Douglas, wrote a letter to his management expressing his concerns about the construction of the door and stating an accident was almost inevitable with the current design. His managers chose not to share this warning with McDonnell Douglas, reasoning it would damage their relationship with a major customer. The DC-10 that would fly for Turkish Airlines 981 was constructed after the American Airlines 96 incident and did have a viewing port installed to enable verification the locking pins were in place. However, the modifications to the cargo door in order to reinforce it, in particular strengthening the torque tube that moved the locking pins, which had been damaged on Turkish Airlines 981, was never completed. This allowed the baggage handler to engage the locking handle and gave the false indication that the door was secure. This was in contrast to the certification that came with the DC-10 which had crashed, which claimed that this work had been successfully carried out. Either through deliberate fraud or by accident, the aircraft was certified as having this maintenance work completed. The result was that Ship 29, which crashed into Ermenonville Forest, was doomed to have the same problems as American Airlines Flight 96. Incredibly, even before the near miss of American Airlines 96, there had been a similar incident during ground testing of the DC-10 before it ever even carried a passenger. During pressurization of the fuselage, in order to test the air conditioning system, the cargo door again blew open, the passenger floor collapsed, and damaged the control cables and hydraulics of the aircraft. McDonnell Douglas put this incident down to the engineer failing to close the door properly, and did not alter the design of the aircraft. Following the disaster of Turkish Airlines 981, the FAA issued the changes proposed after American Airlines 96 as airworthiness directives instead of service bulletins, effectively grounding the DC-10 fleet in the United States until the modifications were carried out. McDonnell Douglas also redesigned the floor of the aircraft to reduce the risk of the structure collapsing. There was never a similar incident involving the DC-10 after these modifications were made. Numerous books and articles have been published about McDonnell Douglas's ethical responsibility in the disaster of Turkish Airlines 981, and it remains a popular case study in engineering ethics. Ultimately, aircraft operate in an unforgiving environment where any error in design can be fatal. The failure of the FAA to mandate the modifications to the DC-10's cargo doors, and McDonnell Douglas's release of a regular service bulletin to modify an aircraft with a critical problem cannot be overlooked in leading to the disaster of Turkish Airlines 981. The FAA would not make the same mistake twice following the crash of American Airlines 191 in 1979. The FAA grounded the DC-10 fleet almost immediately until the problem could be understood and rectified. Taking a similar course of action following the American Airlines 96 incident might have saved all those aboard Turkish Airlines 981. Thank you for listening to Inside the Black Box. Please follow the Inside the Black Box podcast on Twitter at ITBB Podcast. That's India Tango Bravo Bravo Podcast. Thank you.